Hi, Martin. How's it going over there in Mark
Hi.
Neukirchen?
Yeah, pretty good. Hi, Zach. How are you? Good. It's a bit of a rainy day today, but spring is starting, so it's really good.
Yeah, I
Really,
saw that in a
really
couple
good.
of days you have some nice, much warmer weather coming your way.
Yeah, yeah. There was snow like last week, but it's really we're all done with snow,
Yeah,
so everybody's looking forward to spring by now.
awesome. Yeah, it's getting here too, but not always as quickly as you want it to. Cool. So I kind of want to get started by just, kind of having you introduce yourself to the people who are watching this video. So obviously we've met before and talked some, but maybe talk a little bit about you as a person, but also, your role at Voigt and, maybe you as a player to some extent too.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm Martin. I'm with Voigt Brass I've been with Voigt Brass for 2 years now. I It's a family business here in Magnetkirchen, and we are specialized in making brass instruments, um, in particular trombones and trumpets. It's, as I said, a family-run business. My mom is now in charge of running the company, and I uh, joined her at the beginning of this year. And here at the company, I'm responsible for um, everything that is the connection between the musicians and the workshop. So I go out, I do the marketing together with my team, and I try to see myself as a bit of a bridge between the musicians and the workshop, trying to translate the sound concepts and idea that the musicians might have into things that we can carry out in the workshop and adjustments that we can make to our horns to meet these these ideas and concepts that the players have in mind.
Awesome. Cool. So I guess, I haven't sort of announced this on my channel or anything, but you and I have obviously talked and you're aware of this, but and I might do another video kind of before this one, so we'll see. But I'm in the market for a contrabass trombone, so that's kind of why we're all here today and talking. So as a person who's buying a trombone or any instrument, usually you can go to a shop and try, even if it's a retailer, you can try various brands, you can try different couple models, and for contrabass trombone, you can maybe go in the United States. There are a few for sale, some places maybe. Maybe there's something at Horn Guys at LA if they have one at the time. I know that they're one of your dealers, and sometimes they have one, sometimes they don't. Other than that, they're Noah Gladstone, the Brass Arc. There are a handful of people that might have a Contra, and then even going to a conference like we met at TMEA, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were the only people who had a Contra. Maybe there was another one somewhere, but
I believe we were the only ones, yeah, at that particular show. Yeah.
and that's a huge
Yeah.
show that probably usually has at least one more Contra. So it's difficult as a performer and someone who's in the market for trying or buying an instrument to play test them and know what you might want. So that's kind of why we talked about scheduling this as legitimately a thing for me to kind of understand what I might need, but also wanted to kind of clue in someone who might be watching this to kind of understand what's going on. So I guess maybe the best place to kind of start is run down some of the general options that you have. So, I guess there are three types of valves that you use, right?
That's true. We usually choose from three different kinds of valves. That is our classical rotors, standard rotor valves, rotary valves, and then we have something that we invented ourselves, which we call free flow valve. And what this kind of aims at is giving 100% of airflow so that you feel very little resistance when playing the horn, which is particularly interesting on a contrabass trombone. And the third valve option would be Hagman valve, a very prestigious valve from Switzerland, as you might know. And yeah, with the kind of the same underlying concept of all the air going through when you blow. So this is kind of initial question that you have to ask when looking at a contrabass trombone. Yeah,
Right.
which valve do you feel most comfortable with?
Right, which is a difficult choice to know, and
Exactly.
I've played, the most contras that I've played have had Hagman valves, so I feel somewhat at home with that. And kind of on bass trombone right now, I'm playing an axial flow valve, and my kind of thought process is, well, Hagman's not exactly like an axial, but it's maybe similar, but it's the way that it's different is maybe more helpful on a contrabass trombone. I feel like an axial on a contrabass, which obviously isn't an option, but is something that I think, and there are contrabasses that have them, but it seems like that would just be so inefficient, maybe, that it would just be a lot of work to play, whereas the Hagman, I think, might balance that out just a little bit, is kind of my thought process. I don't know if you agree or have other thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's an interesting way to look at it, because basically both valves want to achieve the same effect, which
Right.
is a very free feel when you play the horn, a very easy blowing feel. Um, but we made the experience that the Hagman valves are really very reliable on a contrabass trombone, and are an excellent choice in terms of how they correspond with the overall sound concept of our contrabass trombone. And practicability when you want, when in terms of well, cleaning the horn and doing some maintenance, the Hagman valves are a good choice for a contra.
Yeah, definitely. And then kind of the next extension of the valves is the valve tuning, which, may sound ridiculous, but I feel like I almost have sleepless nights thinking about what configuration I want to have for the valve tuning. So, for someone who maybe doesn't know much about Contra and sees these terms, we see online American tuning, we see online German tuning. Maybe those have, I think once you're in the know, you kind of know what that means, but there's also some kind of variability, especially on the German tuning side, because there's not just one tuning system that German horns
Yeah,
have had forever. So kind of going through the two most common options being the American tuning, which is basically bass trombone, down a fourth. So, you have the instrument in F and then C and D flat as the valve combined to produce A. So my understanding of that is kind of thinking that it's the easiest to kind of jump in on.
mhm,
And because it's so similar and you can play your scales even if maybe you don't know what notes you're playing all the time.
yeah,
And I initially kind of thought that that was the route that I wanted to go, and I'm still not totally decided. But I have been kind of thinking more and more about, kind of the German tuning, and that's more specifically being the D valve and the B flat valve combined to produce A flat. I know there are other tunings that exist, like having the E flat valve, and again, with custom brass manufacturing, anything is possible. I always joke with my students that they're like, I saw this instrument online, and it's like, you can make any brass instrument with a blowtorch and a dream.
yeah,
Anything is kind of possible to make. So the German tuning being that D, B flat, and A flat, and the thing that I kind of think about is, especially the video that I recorded and posted to social media. I played that scale, that excerpt that's basically a scale, and how quickly I had to go out to fourth position. Not that it was a problem, not that it's not possible, but I think what you have to realize if you haven't played Contra before is that that fourth position is further than your typical fourth position because the instrument's so much longer. Whereas if I
yeah,
had German tuning, I could just pop that valve, that D valve down and get that note out just that quickly.
exactly.
So what are your thoughts when you're trying to help someone decide between the two? It's such a big decision, and yet you kind of can't know what you want until you've lived it, I feel like.
Yeah. First of all, I find it very interesting that we have to talk about such a basic questions because, for example, bass trombones and tenor trombones, they are so standardized that you don't have to think about general things like the tuning that you want, the tuning setup that you want on your horn.
Right.
So this is a step that contrabass trombone is necessarily have to take before they get to their instrument. And it's very interesting, and it always requires some thought process to figure out what would be the best option, because as you said, coming from the bass trombone, which is usually the way people go, the it is easier to figure out the positions if you go for the what we call the American tuning, which is a bit problematic term because they're our artist in Vienna, Bernhard Plus, he plays American tuning as well,
Yeah.
and he is all American. So it's hard to pin it down to that geographic aspect. But I think as a working term, it's easy and everybody kind of knows what we are talking about.
Yeah, and even in the
Um,
United States, not everyone plays American tuning. I think
yeah, exactly right.
it's pretty
Yeah,
well split here. Although we call it American tuning and German tuning, but it's not it's not clear either place.
yeah. And but you're right. Coming from the bass trombone, it makes more sense to go for the American tuning because um, you can integrate your knowledge from the slide position from the bass trombone, and it's kind of it makes sense in your head playing on the American tuning system. But what contrabass trombone players tell me many times is that it's worth um, at least considering the European setup, because in terms of efficiency, it's much better,
Right.
and it'll facilitate um, faster passages, and um, it makes a lot of sense on the contrabass trombone. And what we have to keep in mind is that um, you will have to adapt slide positions, because contrabass trombone, at least the models that we make, they are based on the idea of German romantic trombones. So the ratio between the bell section and the slide is different than on modern universal tenor trombones, for example.
Right.
So you need to figure out where your slide positions are on that instrument, and well, the way to get started might be easier on the American setup, but in terms of efficiency, the European configuration is very, very recommendable.
Yeah, and that's kind.
Although,
Yeah, right. And that's the other thing that we can kind of get into. And that the efficiency is definitely something I've been kind of thinking about, not just in that, that one example from Das Rheingold that I played, but also just playing, going from an F to a G flat. If you have both valves producing A flat together, you're only going out so far to get to that G flat. And if you're putting both valves down, they produce A, you're going it seems like an insignificant amount difference when you're talking about it, but in actual playing, that's a pretty big difference, and you don't have all of the same, luxuries that you might have like on a modern bass trombone that has F and G flat, where you can play, in that case, the pedal B flat all the way out in seventh with both valves and then go into that B natural. And it's a really specific example, but because the slide, it is longer, but you don't have as many positions to play with because, we're humans with our arms only being so long. So that efficiency thing, you have to kind of approach it differently. And yeah, I've been talking to some people, and a part of this kind of series that I'm going to be doing on YouTube, I'm planning to kind of reach out to people who are more knowledgeable, people who are actually playing contrabass trombone in real orchestras, real recording sessions, those sorts of things. Since, as of right now, I'm not. That's the goal, is to do those things once I have it, but I can't really do that until I have it. I just say, hey, is bass trombone fine? And most of the time they say yes. But that's not exactly what I'm kind of overall going for. So what I've kind of talked to some people so far just a little bit is, you're going to have to spend time learning the instrument anyway. You might as well learn the valve tuning setup that is optimal, and not just the one that is quicker to learn, because the blow is different, the intonation is different. Like you say, it's based off of a romantic trombone, so the ratios of things are a little bit different. So I think that's kind of one point of the American tuning that is worth mentioning, is that it's not necessarily just going to automatically be a perfect setup where it's, oh, I pick it up and now I can play any piece in any, Wagner opera or, Strauss or what, whatever the case may be. It's not going to really be that simple. Not saying it's going to be so hard either, but if you're thinking that it's going to save you, months and months of practice, I don't know that that's really the truth.
No, not really, not really. And I mean, both systems have their advantages, and eventually, of course, you would get used to both. Um, but you're absolutely right that to start off with, you will have to put effort in getting to know the instrument, um, with whichever tuning setup you choose. Um, it'll not it'll not be you just pick up the contrabass and it'll play exactly the way your bass plays. That's a fact.
Right. Yeah. 100%. So, yeah, so I guess the other angle of the valve tuning, like we've kind of talked about and you've done for some other artists, is the idea of it being a variable tuning and having multiple options. So my kind of understanding, and kind of correct me if I'm wrong or if there may be multiple ways that you can do it, but you tend to set that up as if it's an American tuning instrument mostly, but then you put a larger slide in to have the B flat slide, and maybe you have to adjust the D flat slide to get it to be narrow enough to accept a D slide. Is that kind of
Exactly. You'll get a set of additional tuning bows, and then you can just exchange them and switch to the other tuning system.
and then with that, the German European tuning, you have that same tuning now, but correct me if I'm wrong, but now the valves are flipped as far as what they do, correct? Or am I wrong on that? So it would be the thumb being B flat and the index or middle finger being, am I right on that?
Hold on here. Yes, I think, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So it would be the similar, you'd have the same options, but if you were to have that variable tuning setup, maybe one potential downside is that in the future, if you decided to go to a different instrument, a different model or whatever, and you wanted to have it be a German tuning instrument from the ground up, you essentially would be backwards from everybody else.
Could happen if you don't bring it to the workshop to change your lever setup.
Gotcha.
So one question that we ask everybody who plans to purchase a contrabass trombone is how they want to set up their lever, because you can put either valve on the thumb or on the middle finger.
Right, where the valve physically is, if it's the first one or the second one, is not necessarily tied to what.
No, not at all, not at all. So if you want to permanently switch to the other tuning system, and you'd like to stick to the way you use your levers, then that's an adjustment that we'd have to make in order to make it fit. That's true. Yeah.
Gotcha. So I guess it's not as, it's more reasonable than I kind of thought, because you can switch those levers around. I didn't really think about it from that kind of perspective. So if down the road it's like,
it's not something that you do at home, right? It's
Right.
not something that you get a second lever kit and you just exchange it at home. You'd have to bring it to the workshop for the adjustment to be done.
Right, which is easier said than done for someone in the United States.
Yes, it is. Because you want to make sure that the levers feel the exact way they did before.
Right.
It's doable.
Okay.
It's absolutely doable.
That's an interesting idea that I hadn't really thought about. I guess one other question with this variable tuning idea, it probably depends on which valves you use, but in some cases, do you then have to make the what would be the D flat valve on the slide for that? Does that have to become more narrower? Can it not be as wide, I guess? Because is that true, or am I not correct in that? Does that not affect it?
No, the major difference is really the part of the attachment that you exchange. So the instrument itself it does change a little bit. You have to adapt the general appearance of the instrument a tiny little bit, but the essential part is really the the bow that you interchange.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's just these are such specific details that you don't really think about. And, at the end of the day, brass instruments are simple. It's just we're adding tubing to make the instrument longer. But then when these really specific details come up, it becomes not so simple.
Because as soon as you talk about changing uh, bows and crooks and slides, something that is easy to forget is that you have to make it fit your case. And our interchangeable model allows us to, there is a great Marcus Bonner case for contrabass trombone with cut bell
Right.
that even makes the instrument fit in the overhead compartment
Oh, I don't think
of
I
the
realized that one fits. I've seen it online a good bit, but I didn't realize it
it
fits.
slides right in.
Wow.
It's perfect.
That's very exciting. I hadn't really thought of that.
And the change that you make is so small that the case works for both options, and we can make sure that you will always be able to carry both setups to your gig.
Interesting. Cool. I guess maybe we should pivot towards the other details of the instrument. So I think we've kind of covered valves enough, and I have some things to think about, and maybe the viewer does as well for their contrabass trombone of the future. My understanding, looking at the website, all of your slides are the same configuration. Is that correct?
That's true. It's a dual bore slide that we use, coming from that German tradition. The Romantic German trombone traditionally has a dual bore slide, which brings along a very specific character of your sound, and it really it's strong enough for the contrabass trombone. Strong is maybe a bit of a weak adjective to describe it, but we played around with single bore slides, and they're just not receptive enough for all of the power that you want to generate with your contrabass trombone. So the dual bore slide is really the perfect fit. We used to use, or we are using nickel silver outer slides because they are light, and in terms of the balance of the instrument, they are a good fit. But we made a prototype just very recently using gold brass outer slides, and they significantly added to the warmth of the overall sound, and it's a nice option too. But well, in terms of durability and weight, nickel silver slides are handy on a contrabass trombone.
Right. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an instrument manufacturer, so I know a lot of things, but I don't know necessarily everything. Nickel silver, in my understanding, is a little bit more durable and less likely to have. I mean, you shouldn't dent it or do anything. It'll still dent, but it's maybe a little bit better for that, especially for such a long slide, and it's a little bit easier to draw from a manufacturing process as well.
Yes, it is. The alloy itself is very sturdy, sturdier than, for example, brass or gold brass. So it's harder to scratch, and I mean, instrument makers went from brass inner slides to nickel silver inner slides as a general move, and it kind of proves the good qualities that nickel silver brings along for hand slides.
Sure.
On trombones in general. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess the nickel silver thing kind of makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I like the idea of brass slides too from a sound perspective, but especially physically. And when I always think, I think I have maybe three instruments that have nickel silver slides. So for pretty much all of my jazz playing, I use a nickel silver slide, kind of for that same sort of thought process of it's maybe a little bit faster because it's a little bit lighter and kind of easier to work with. And it's maybe a little bit more responsive, but again, I don't know if this is all in my head sometimes, or if it's actually, you could say that this is a fact because of this metal reason or something.
I think you're right that in general it produces a very crisp sound and it's very responsive. It's very quick in terms of the sound production. The feedback is very immediate, and it's yeah. I think that's what nickel silver does, and it's really a good balance
Which I think is
for
really important to think about that. Sorry, that responsiveness because of this is a long instrument. This is we're talking about 12 feet. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in meters off the top of my head, but it's a much longer instrument than what we're used to. So that's much more. Your air has to go further. That responsiveness, to me, kind of theoretically, is really important because I worry about the instrument being so slow to respond. And not saying the gold brass version would, but I think that there's a trade-off of this kind of big Teutonic sound that you might get from the gold brass slide, that then on the responsiveness, it's maybe just that little bit not as quick.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, generally speaking, nickel silver outer slides are the standard to achieve exactly that.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things that I struggle with some of my students when they're talking about instruments, it's like, I want to upgrade. It's so clear that this one is better than this one. And I think especially what we're just talking about between these two slides, there is no upgrade between the two of them. It's a trade-off. And
Yes.
there's pros and cons no matter what decision as long as the instrument is functioning, it's not just a clear upgrade. There are always these little details of, bigger sound but less responsive, and more agile maybe, but not as big for a gigantic orchestra or something. And maybe that's something we've kind of talked about a little bit, but I haven't necessarily clued in people watching this video of what my kind of purpose for this contra is. I mean, obviously there's a part of me that just wants a big trombone, and that's exciting. But I do remote recording sessions, and I do get asked sometimes, hey, can you play contrabass trombone? I kind of have to say, oh, I don't have one, but I can play all the notes on bass trombone and use a bigger mouthpiece and kind of make it, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to sell them and get the gig.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I want to get a contrabass trombone. But at the same time, there also are real orchestral performances that require, or at least maybe in the United States, you can't say require because people play them on bass trombone so often, but, that often feature a contrabass trombone, especially in larger symphony orchestras and, the kind of big time opera orchestras. If it says contrabass trombone, most likely you're going to use contrabass trombone. I know the Dallas Symphony performed part of Das Rheingold recently, and they used contrabass trombone because that's what Wagner wanted. And so my kind of goal is twofold. I want to be kind of eligible for those gigs in the real world with orchestras, opera orchestras, ballet work, anything like that. But I also want it for, whatever someone might ask from the standpoint of a remote recording session, which to me are kind of different goals, generally speaking. Like talking about these slides, I would think if I just want to play in an orchestra, maybe that gold brass slide is a great option, thinking, gigantic orchestra with maybe a full choir or something in some piece, and just having that massive sound would be great. But what people tend to write for a lot of times for contrabass trombone for movie music and things like that is, the more, let's say, aggressive side of those instruments a little bit, that in thinking about that responsiveness being so important to me of, I don't want that like really loud, aggressive low note to feel like I have to work hard or that it's late speaking. And again, not saying that that's what would happen with the gold brass necessarily, but I think that there's a trade-off of big, Teutonic Wagner sound versus maybe more of the commercial movie
Absolutely.
music sort of thing and that's just the slide. We haven't even talked about bells yet.
I think I think you're right there with the gold brass outer slides, you'd follow more a path of blending in, whereas with the nickel silver outer slides, it's with the crisp sound that you get, you stick out. And I mean, when you are lucky to employ a contrabass trombonist in your orchestra for um, Wagner and try to go back to the sound concept that the composer envisioned back in the days, then I mean, you should be able to hear it and not just have an instrument that blends in perfectly and doesn't have the chance to stick out. And I think it's easier to get there with the nickel silver outer slide. Yeah.
Sure.
And there is another very down to earth aspect of it. With the nickel silver, you are really absolutely um, safe in terms of now correct me if I got the term wrong, zinc past or red past. How do you call it?
I'm not sure what you.
Let me see. It's when the copper starts to make little holes in
Oh, like red
brass.
rot?
Red rod, that's
Red
it.
rot, yeah.
It's red rod. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess I didn't really think about it from that standpoint too. So it's not just more kind of durable in the day-to-day use, but there's maybe a longevity aspect of,
Exactly.
not we hope all brass never experiences red rot or anything like that, but it can happen. It eventually probably will happen. But nickel silver, that's
With
not.
nickel silver, you're on the safe side. There's no chance for it to cause any problem.
Yeah, it's something I maybe knew but never really thought about in that way. Awesome. So that's kind of the slide. We've got the slide. We've got the valves. Kind of the last step, and probably the one that I spend the most time thinking about and worrying about, is the bell configuration. And because I feel like we have more options with, especially compared to most American manufacturers. There are a ton of different options with bells that they have, but things of garlands and crayons is like that's not something we really do too much over here. So that's something that I know about, especially to some extent because I also play tuba, and one of my F tubas is a German tuba that has a crayons on it, and so I'm used to that to some extent and have experience playing ones with and without. But it's still one of those concepts that it's kind of hard to, really know what's happening as the player. And then also we have the Selmer rim, which that was new to me. That was something you kind of explained to me the last time we met and worked on some contra stuff. So that's something I kind of know and kind of understand and can point out what it is. But maybe if you could talk about, and we can get to materials of the bell later, but the crayons or Selmer rim or all of those sorts of things, and what you think is helpful for the performer or someone looking for a contra in a no.
Sure. So maybe looking at the history of the crayons and why it's still a popular feature in Germany and Europe is that back in the days the technical possibilities of the instrument makers were limited compared to nowadays. So in order to make bells, they had to spread out the material very thin. And if you look at the contrabass bell or tuba bell, it's really it's a huge bell diameter, and the instrument makers really had to go to the extreme limit of what was possible with the brass sheets they had access to back in the days. And so initially, the crayons really was a reinforcement feature to make sure that the thin material wouldn't crack or rip apart. And then later, bell making advanced, and for example, especially for the bigger bells like the contrabass trombone bells, we do two-piece bells. So we manufacture the bell from two parts and then weld it together. So you don't have to spread out the material as thin.
So you have the stem as one piece and the flare as another piece, correct?
Exactly right. Yeah. And what you achieve is a very even wall thickness of the flare, which is interesting, especially on larger belts. When we experimented with the crayons, which was first something essential to hold the bell together, and then later got more of an optional feature. We added the crans. We worked with bells without crans, but it turned out to be very interesting for the core of your sound. So if you really want a very centered sound, then the crans is something that will add to that. Um, and prevent, especially when you play fortissimo, will prevent the sound from kind of getting ugly.
Hmm.
The crunch kind of prevents that from happening, and adds a little adds core throughout the entire range of dynamics that you wanna create. Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah, I think I kind of knew some of the historical elements of it. I knew that it was definitely thinner, but I guess I didn't totally think about it that it was this is the only way that we can really make this work, and because it's going to be so thin on these bells. So that's very interesting to kind of think about. And nowadays we don't have to do that, but we may still choose to do that, which is
exactly.
kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
So you kind of offer a few different things with the bells. You know, there's the bell with the crayons, there's the bell without the crayons, and
right.
which is what most people are thinking about when they think about a trombone bell, at least in the United States, is no crayons. That's your standard bell. But then there's that third option that's kind of in the middle, right? The Selmer rim. Can you talk
The
about that
marim,
maybe a
yeah.
little bit?
Yeah. So what we do with the salmon rim, we don't add any additional material. The crans is a nickel silver strip that we add on top of the bell, and the salmon rim is just the material that we fold and spread back further towards the stem. So you'll see a bit of a rim from the material of the bell, and it kind of follows the same logics of kind of preventing the sound from getting ugly when you play very loud. And it's really another aspect of protecting your bell. So it's two elements, right? Protecting the bell from damage because it's just a reinforcement that you get, and then adding that special core characteristic center to the sound that you might like on a contrabass trombone, because that's really what it comes down to. The preferences you have as a player, yeah, Kranz and Salmarim are kind of on the same page when it comes to the sound concept that you might have in mind.
Interesting. Yeah, and you kind of pointed to that there's like a durability factor, and I think that that's not as much of a concern today as you were kind of talking about, but you do see occasionally instruments that have split bells, and that they have to patch or something like that. Most of that, at least in my kind of experience, is much older instruments that probably were I don't want to say too thin, because maybe that's what makes them special,
Yeah,
but on the thinner side, that maybe we don't see quite that thin today, because we simply don't have to do that, even if you still could choose to, I suppose.
right.
So yeah, so the Selmer rim, that's the same sheet, like it's not an extra piece of brass, it's just folding
No,
that
no, it's
one
not.
piece over
Right.
itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
When you got the bell on the lathe, then you fold the the edge of the bell and work it back towards the stem, and that's how you get the Selmer rim. And it's kind of a specific thing to do. It requires certain set of skills that the bell maker has to bring along. So it's something. It's kind of a nice feature that you rarely find on other instruments. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's something that was, I spent a lot of time on the internet looking at trombones and things, but that was something I hadn't, maybe I'd come across, but it didn't register to me as something different. And especially sometimes looking at instruments online, that's something that's really easy to miss, because it's the same material, same color, and it's pretty small,
Yeah.
from looking online. In person, it's pretty obvious. You see it and it's like, oh, what's that? I don't know what that is.
Right.
But
Right.
online, sometimes it's really easy to kind of miss that slight detail.
Exactly. And it turned out to correspond very nicely with the Hagman valves. So for example, in our Hagman bass trombone, we always use the Selmer rim because it's just a very good fit for some reason, um, these both these two features, they really get along with each other very, very well.
That's very
So
interesting. Yeah, and I think that's something that's important with when you're selecting an instrument, to kind of know that, it's not, again, one thing isn't better, and when you change one thing, you might also want to change something else to either balance it out or bring out that detail in a way. Like one thing that I kind of think about is, and a lot of the instruments that have, gold brass bells, sometimes that nickel silver slide kind of helps balance out those sorts of things,
exactly.
and maybe push it back towards the middle a little bit. So that's kind of an interesting idea to think about, that Selmer rim as a pairing for the Hagman valves. That's definitely helpful for me to know and kind of process and think a little bit about.
Yeah, definitely.
And then, so I guess some of the other bell options, you also have different bell flare sizes as well, right? You do both 10 and 11, is that correct? 10, 11
Right,
inches?
right. Yeah, yeah. While, or I have to say that the most people opt for the wider bell
Mm-hmm.
and go for the 11 inches, and 10 inches is something that we make as a special option on request type of thing. Uh, um, Generally speaking, we recommend the 11-inch bell because it corresponds very well with the whole concept of the instrument.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely interesting to think about, is, what's normal. Because I think that's one thing that's, from someone who maybe hasn't experienced a custom maker before, you can make things that you may not even think are the best instrument, or the right setup that's going to work for the player, because you're, from a manufacturing side, you're capable of so much. But that's, the manufacturing side and the kind of design side are almost, they obviously work together, but you can make something that is a beautiful instrument that is machined perfectly. It's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but it could be designed in a way that maybe just doesn't meet your needs as a player, or, even you can get into such specifics as it doesn't work with your concert hall that you play in, or things like that. So it's interesting from the 10-inch bell perspective that, yes, you can make it, you're willing to make it, some people might like it, but you kind of feel strongly that the 11-inch is probably the way to go and is the better choice for most people.
And that's sometimes the experience of the instrument maker that kicks in. That are things that even go beyond um, phenomena that physics and acoustics can explain. That's just where the instrument maker says, okay, from my experience as an instrument maker that I gathered over the course of many years and decades, I'd recommend that. And yeah, that's kind of our task when we go through the customizing process, to combine the ideas and requirements of the musicians and the experience of the instrument maker, and of course laws of physics and acoustics, and match all these aspects, and then get the ideal instrument for the player. Right? It might
Right.
not be a good fit for another player, but that's the that's the advantage of customization. What really makes it very, very interesting.
Yeah, we have to answer all these questions of how do you play, where are you playing, and what are you playing? Those are all key factors. And I see so many people online, it's like, again, going back to that idea of I upgraded to this instrument, or I switched to this thing and it's better for me. And it's like, well, but what you're doing really matters and really comes into play as being a very key element of that. And there's so many details, and your playing may change over time as well, or what you're doing with the instrument. Maybe I start out and I exclusively am doing remote recording sessions on Contra, and then maybe later on it's almost exclusively playing, operas and things. Those are, you kind of want to, in a way, prepare for all of that, but also there is, I'm not going to buy 5 Contras for every single situation, because we haven't talked about this, but they're not necessarily the cheapest instrument in the world. They do cost some money. So I want, I personally, and I think probably most people, want to find a contrabass trombone that fits everything because it's probably the only one you're going to get. Whereas
Right.
tenor trombones, they're not cheap. I don't want to say that they don't
Yeah.
cost money. They do cost money, but
Yeah.
they're much more reasonable to own two, own
Right.
three, own
Right.
four, and some people weigh more than that. But
Exactly.
so I think that from the contra perspective, I think that's partially why I'm so not worried, but I'm so interested in figuring out what's the best configuration because
Yeah.
yes, you could maybe swap out take the bell off and put a different bell on, those sorts of things, but none of that's going to be easy, and it's probably going to be expensive or
Yeah.
worst case or best case scenario, it just takes time, and I have to send the horn back over to you, and
Right.
it's not going to
Yeah.
be just a simple decision to change something down the road, even though it's probably possible. And I could always entertain getting a second one, but that's a lot of money.
It
And
is. It really is.
so
But maybe on a soothing note for everybody who's looking into purchasing a contrabass trombone, there are some aspects that you really need to think about, and then there are other aspects where it's a mix of a very nuanced difference that the feature will make
mhm,
and some trust in the instrument maker and his or her experiences, right? So you definitely have to think a lot about the valves and the valve setup. That's crucial. You should be less worried. I mean, it's something interesting to look into, but you should be less worried about bow material and outer slide material because these effects are way less significant than the valves and the valve setup because that'll accompany your playing hours uh, in a much more intense way than the alloy of your bell. And we as an instrument maker, we guarantee to manufacture a horn that will be usable in different musical contexts. And it's not only a recording contract, it's not only a Wagner
yeah,
contract, not at all. So that's what we make sure from the start that you get a horn that is versatile enough to fit different contexts. So maybe not for people to freak out about it. There are things that you really have to take time to consider, and then there are other aspects that you should discuss with your instrument maker, but it's not something that should keep you awake at night because it's where the instrument maker can contribute with a lot of experience and make sure that the instrument is going to be a good fit and a good companion for your musical career.
sure, yeah, and I think especially for us Americans and thinking about contrabass trombone specifically, I've had several teachers and so many acquaintances that are great bass trombone players. There's so few people to talk to over here about this sort of stuff. So even one person's experience is helpful, but it's a manufacturer in some ways has so much more that they can offer because this won't be your first contrabass trombone that your company is making, right? This isn't the
No,
first time that you're doing this. It's not even close to that. So you've had people, positive and probably a little bit negative too feedback that you get from someone that says, yeah, I really like this element, but this one didn't work as well for what I thought it would. And some of that takes so much time. I might not really know the instrument for another 5 years until I really have practiced it, maybe swapped out some mouthpieces, put it in these kind of stress tests of playing it with this orchestra, playing it in this hall, playing it in this recording session, all of those sorts of things that it's not like you're just going to figure it out after a month of owning it. That everything about the instrument now.
yeah, yeah. Um, and I mean, just like the customization process, instrument making is very iterative. So you make something, you have people test it, and then you get feedback, and then you change. And we've been making contrabass trombones for over 30 years now. So there's a lot of feedback from musicians going into the work that we're doing and our own experiences and knowledge. And yeah, and that's something that is a good basis for the customizing that we are about to start. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess just we're kind of running out of time, but I want to cover just a couple more things with the bell. So then material is also an option that we have gold brass and yellow brass bell
Right.
options. And my again thinking is if I going more that operatic large orchestra sort of thing, the gold brass may be more the way that I'd want to go, but maybe if we're leaning more towards the commercial side, the yellow brass, and then the reality is I'll probably whatever I get I'll use it for both of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Gold brass is a little more common on the contrast that we make.
Mm-hmm.
Just statistically, we made more contrabass trombones with a gold brass bell. So that's an aspect that's worth considering. But um, yellow brass is, I'll say, malleable enough to fit the opera context and the commercial context. It's just very flexible in terms of the sound that you want to create. Whereas gold brass brings along a natural warmth that you might have to put some effort in to get on a yellow brass horn. But the yellow brass bell will absolutely be able to cover the entire range of warmth that you might want or not want when you play.
Sure, and yeah, that's something for me. I have almost exclusively yellow bells,
Okay.
not necessarily because I think that that's the superior thing or anything like that. But again, I do kind of feel the same way that you can do everything with yellow. Not saying you can't do these other things, but I all of these instruments are going to have flexibility of how they sound from what you're doing as the player, maybe what mouthpiece you're using. But I think a lot of it is being maybe at what dynamic does this change? If I'm thinking about getting a really punchy contrabass trombone sound, I feel like I would maybe have to play a little bit louder even on a gold brass bell to get that sort of sound, which it's still possible. But again, that's kind of maybe what you're saying in the working a little bit harder, trying to make that happen from the player standpoint, where maybe that line is moved back a little bit softer on a yellow brass bell.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how
Yeah.
you think about it to some extent?
Yeah, I'd agree. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Um,
But then again,
yeah.
if you really have to adapt to the musical setting, um, together with the instrument, you can always look at lead pipes too, which make a fundamental difference.
Yeah, and I guess that's something we didn't totally talk about. Does the Contra come with a singular removable lead pipe, or
Yeah, by
um,
default, there is singular removable lead pipe, but of course, we talk to the player and say, okay, these are the options: sterling silver, standard yellow brass, gold brass, red brass, even or copper, and that's something where you can reinforce the effect of the bell or maybe counteract a little bit
mhm,
or balance it out. So this is a parameter that you can alter easily,
right?
whereas changing a bell gives a bit of
Yeah,
trouble, right? But lead pipe is really easy to adapt. If you really want to make the instrument get closer to a certain musical idea.
sure.
Yeah.
And then one last thing with the bell, detachable bell player. We kind of talked about it a little bit, and you even have one behind you. I assume not a contra bell, but you have one detachable bell flare right behind your head. So that's something to consider also. And I think that there's obviously a practical side of a cut bell,
Very much.
and that contrabass trombones are already very large. If you don't have a cut bell, traveling with it seems, from someone who hasn't done it but has flown with tubas and things. I imagine that a fixed bell flare is probably not the most fun to fly with and do all of those sorts of things. But there also is the other side that is what does it affect the playing? And you see things online of people who say, oh, it doesn't do anything, oh, it changes everything, you should never cut a bell, you should, make sure that you try out that bell, those sorts of things. And I personally today have 0 cut bells, but if you ask me in 2 years, I might have 4. I'm not really sure. It's something that I'm thinking about almost making a complete switch to in some ways, because of those practical sides. And you talked about the Marcus Bona case that there's a screw bell case, but there's also double screw bell cases for which again for flying can make things really nice. I know that there's several, maybe not several, but there are multiple people who have a double contra and bass trombone screw bell case, and when you compare the two cases side by side, the screw bell contra and the double screw bell contra bass, they almost look the same. I mean, it's obviously a little bit bigger, but there's something to that is very practical. So I think practical, it's a pretty easy win. The detachable bell flare.
Absolutely.
What do you find, or what do you tell people when they're asking about detachable bell flares as far as sound, playability, all of those sorts of things?
Yes. I think it really is an absolutely delicate topic to talk about, because on the one hand, you pay so much attention on the wall thickness of your bell, right? And you put so much effort in getting it just right. And you talk about one-piece bells and two-piece bells, and you really want to make sure that the material and its thickness gets the ideal kind of configuration, and then you take it apart
Yeah,
and
you cut it.
add a screw ring.
Yeah.
So it definitely makes a huge difference to the way the bell will vibrate and resonate, and you have to be aware of that. From our experience, the more weight you add to the bell, the more you add to the core and the center of the sound. So you kind of multiply the effect of a krantz or a garland or a Selmer rim by adding the cut bell, or like going for a cut bell, because you add material, you add weight, and it adds to the overall core of the sound. I I'm very careful recommending one or the other, because it's a very individual choice to make.
Mm-hmm.
But as a general tendency, that's where you kind of end up with more core with the cut bell, and maybe more vibration, a bit more resonance without it. But it's a very heated debate, and
Right.
it's a very individual approach from between different players.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about it as multiplying some of the effects of having that extra weight around the crayons or the Selmer rim or anything like that. So kind of by the reverse logic of that, is there anything that you think about doing if, let's say, I don't really want to go that sort of sound concept and playing concept, if I want to kind of, again, be more on that commercial side, that sort of thing, do you think about maybe, okay, then we have to go yellow brass, or maybe we don't do a garland, but we can do a Selmer rim, or we shouldn't do either? Do you think about it in kind of terms of that in any way?
We have a very good friend and contrabass trombone player up in Portland, and he opted for John Onstead, and he opted for the gold brass bell as a cut bell with a nickel silver krantz. And he needs the contrabass trombone in very different musical settings, trombone choir, smaller groups, bigger ensembles, and of course, full-blown symphonic orchestra. And he's very happy with the choices that he made, and he thinks that the cutback corresponds very well with the overall sound that he has in mind. Um, I think I would not um, exclude any option to go along with the cut bell. I think I wouldn't say that if you add a kranz, don't go for the cut bell. Just choose the cut bell if you go for a plain yellow brass bell without any rim or kranz, just the regular bell.
Hmm.
I think we don't have to be as black and white
Sure.
when we look at that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a lot to. Again, you're trying to tell me not to worry about it too much, but it's also it's so fascinating to me that it's like it's hard for me to not think about it so much
Right.
and
Right.
try to
Right.
pinpoint. It's like you want to maximize this big
Yeah.
purchase of getting the absolute best thing for you, and for the
Right.
situations you might put it in. But it definitely is interesting to kind of process all of these things. Cool. We've kind of, we've talked about a ton of different things, and I really appreciate your time. Certainly, are there any other things that maybe I didn't lead you to that we should talk about, or that someone watching this might want to find out about?
Um, Another aspect that we came across is the temperament of the instrument. So you should look into the temperament of your ensembles and orchestras. Here in Europe, it's very common to go for a 443 Hertz, and sometimes American orchestras and ensembles they play a bit lower and go for 440 as a standard um, pitch. So that's something that you have to make sure you communicate to the instrument maker before you order the instrument. That's something that we ask all the players. Of course, you can go from 440 to 443, right? But then your range of alteration might be limited because you already have to cover such a
Right.
big difference of pitch. So that's something interesting to look into, and something that you touch upon very briefly, the what's the word? Practical
Practicality.
aspect of
Yeah.
practicality, right? Thank you. If you can foresee that there's going to be a lot of traveling happening with your contrabass trombone, you have to bear in mind that the contrabass trombone will have to be at your side, and either book another seat on the flight
Right.
or be able to just slide it into the overhead compartment. So these are practical plane aspects that you need to think about before you um, go ahead and order, right?
Right. And especially, thinking for me, it's like, yeah, if I'm just sitting at home doing remote recording sessions, cut bell is irrelevant information for me. It's only if it helps the sound in a way that I want. But from a
Right.
practical sense, it doesn't matter. But then again, there's the desire and hope that, I have the contrabass and everybody's calling and, hey, can
Yeah.
you fly out to this performance of this piece? And, so there's that pie in the sky dream and hope that kind of happens. And some of it too
Right.
can be self-inflicted of travel, as far as, I might want to do a recital tour, which is something I can make happen and say, oh, I want to play contrabass trombone, therefore I want to have a cut bell for travel. So some of it is your own decision and how you plan on using it. But yeah, just to touch on the 440 versus 443 sort of thing too. I think one thing that's kind of I find always interesting in the United States is I feel like there's a lot of we say 440, but I'm not always sure that we actually do 440, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about and prepare for. Because I think most of the time when you do see it printed, like, sometimes on an audition, excerpt list, it'll say, this city symphony, adheres to 440 hertz. But I'm not sure that always happens. And obviously there's flexibility in that. But I think sometimes in the United States we have this idea that we do 440, which is not always true.
Yeah, right. But we had cases where we had people sending back the horns to be able to tune them to pitch them to 440. So that's why we are cautious, and we point to that fact that at least you should at least give it a thought
Yeah.
before going ahead and buying the
Yeah, and
horn.
I
Yeah,
think especially for me, I would think it has to be able to do 440,
right.
like that, because especially for remote recording, that's another thing, is that sometimes that is specified, and in that way, a lot of the stuff that I do ends up being closer to 440 because we're using synthesized instruments that we're playing along with, and everything kind of is getting constantly pulled back to 440, even if we tend to drift at some point. Whereas in the orchestra, obviously there are pitched instruments that can't move, the xylophone or whatever, but those aren't
Yeah,
most of the main instruments that we use in the orchestra have flexibility of
right.
precise tuning.
Mhm.
So, I think from that standpoint, I would think it has to be able to do 440, but I don't want to neglect the other,
Yeah,
442,
sure.
443, around that sort of realm, because it's going to be somewhat. I think it's going to happen whether or not it's spoken that we tune to 443 or something, but it, it moves there more often than you might think.
Right.
Um, well, great. Are there any other things that we should maybe cover or anything like that? Or you think we've kind of, we've talked about so many things, and it's been so helpful for me as a customer, and also just, curiosity too. I think that I like talking about these things and thinking about them, maybe to my own detriment sometimes, but
I think we covered all the essential elements. Something that you don't have to worry about is the water key, because we always equip the horns with the extended water key so that you can just press with your thumb and then it'll open all the way down. So you don't have to get an arm extension to reach all the way down to the end of your hand slide. So that's something that where we get you covered. And we talked about the hand slide, the bell, the valves, the valve setup. I think that's really um, all it needs
yeah.
um, for the decision process.
Yeah, and with the long water key, that's something that I've known about for a decent amount of time, from mostly from playing contras. I know that you can do that on other instruments, but that's not something that you see too often, especially in the United States, on anything else other than contras.
Right.
But
Right.
I'll try to like overlay something to, I assume most people watching this video don't know what you're talking about there, and haven't seen that, because we don't see that very much here,
Uh-huh.
because it's not necessary. It's a cool thing regardless, but it's not necessary on a standard tenor trombone. Most of us can reach that pretty easily, so it's not a huge concern. But contra, that's a little bit of a different story.
Yeah, it's a different story. You're right.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll call it there. And obviously, we'll have much more kind of communication of things, and we'll get things dialed in and figure out all that sort of stuff.
Sounds perfect.
Awesome.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Perfect.